Today we're going to be creating our very own chat room with React technology to power the front end and WebSockets to power the messaging to different clients who are inside the chat room. So let's create our project directory first. Chat room app. Alright, and now let's go inside it. And I like to create two directories, one for each server that we're going to run. First for our socket server, and then also for our front end, which is going to be done via create React app. And while that's running, let's go over to our socket server and install WebSockets. And before I do that, I have to initialize this directory. So I can use npm install. npm install WebSockets WS. And that's gonna happen in a short while. Alright, that's done, and this is it's already done. So let's get our text editor up. And now let's open up the front end. And let's discuss what our component hierarchy for this is going to be. So we're going to be here in app.js, and let's have app.js going on. So in order for that to happen, I have to go into the front end and do an npm start. And that's going to launch our web browser for us. So here's our web browser, and this is what our React app looks like at the moment. It's just right out of the box, the template. So let's get rid of this and discuss what's going to be in our app. So in our app, I want there to be, of course, the app component is at the top. And after the app component, I want there to be either a login or that messaging panel, because I need to take in a name in order for there to be some bit of organization inside the chat room. So I can display the name along with their message so people know who it is. So we have a login. We'll do nothing that fancy, no authentication. And we'll have a messaging panel or messaging container. And inside that messaging panel, after they're logged in, we want there to be a display conversation element, and we also want there to be a messaging box where they will insert anything, and that will be sent to the server so that their messages can be displayed to all the clients. Alright, so let's leave this as comments down here, and let's create our React app. So for the front end, we need to create these components. So I'm going to copy that. So we have something we can copy and paste easily into while we're creating all these components. Let's create a login component. Let's create a messaging panel. Let's create a display conversation. And also, let's create a messaging box. Alright, so we can take all of this and put it in here, and we don't actually need this line. We can say messaging box extends component, and we'll put messaging box here. So in case we need to style anything, we have it already identified. And let's put messaging box down here. Alright, so let's do messaging panel here. And then we'll export it out. And display conversation here. Let's get it. Display conversation, and we can export that. Display conversation. Alright, and we're going to have a login component. login. All right, let's implement the login first, because it's easy to think about what a login does. A login is going to be a form where we insert our username. And we want that username to be available to the app so we can identify who is sending what information. So let's create an input type, text, and we'll ID it as username. And also, let us create an input type, submit, and let's give it a value of login to display to the user. Alright, so we have that. Let's label this username so that the user knows to put their username inside. And a little bit of styling, not too heavy on the styling here. You can do that on your own, is we'll put some breaklines there. Alright, so now we have username. We have this component in charge of getting the login information. But we don't want it just to stick in this login information. We want that login information to go into the app, so the entire app knows that we're logged in. So the way that we're going to implement that is by storing username in state in the app component. So initially, when we're not logged in, we're going to have it equal to null. And then we're going to display the login component. And in the login component, we want there to be a way to lift this information up. Whatever the user types here in username, we want them to be able to grab it in app. So the way that we accomplish this in React is through a very common paradigm called lifting state. We're going to create a callback function here. Let's call it set username. And the thing that we want that's in the child components, we're going to put it as parameters inside the function definition. So we're going to have username being passed in here, but we don't know what it is yet. So what we're going to pass is just a callback. We're going to pass that callback as props. So we're going to have this dot set username. And when we establish that inside props called set username, we can go into the login function and we have access to something that can be called by this dot props dot set username. And it's a function. We want to take what the value of this is down here and place it in here. And the way that we're going to accomplish that is by creating another function for an onSubmit event. So we're going to call this function this dot login. We'll call it login. And when we log in, we want this function to occur. Since it's attached to an event listener, we're going to have the ability to take in the event as an object. So there's E. So the most important part about E is the target, because the target is what what you're performing the event on, which is this form. But we don't want the entire form. We want the username, which is a child. So we can go into username and we want its value. So now we have its value. We want to take this value and we want to place it in set username. So let's take this set username, callback, and pass in that as the username. And remember, when we do a submit, when we click submit, we're going to have a refresh of the page. But we want this to be a single page application. So we're just going to do prevent default. So we don't have any refreshes of the page or anything, just to give it the illusion of a single page application. So we now have username up there in app. And we have it up here. And the way that we can see that is if I do console log username, we should see it. And we should see that it's an app.js. Login is not defined. So we have to import our components. Import login from, it's from the same directory. All right, so I'm gonna open up console and I'm gonna type in my username, which is Patrick. And I see Patrick is there and it's coming from app.js 12. So app.js 12 is where we did that console log. So the beauty about that is that we can set state to it. We can set state just by simply creating a JavaScript object with this syntax, because the username attribute is the same as the username variable, which is being provided as the value. So this is sufficient enough for this. But we want this login component to only appear if the username is null, meaning that the user is not signed in. So let us do this.state.username. We have to put this in JSX. This.state.username. You can use truthy and falsy values for this. If there is no username yet, if it's null, if it's undefined, then we want to display our login component. But if there is a username, we want to display two different components, or rather one component, this messaging panel, which we're about to implement. So there's our messaging panel. And just to see that that's what's happening, I'm going to write the word messaging panel here. And then we're going to take a look. Messaging panel is not defined though. So in addition to login, we have to put in messaging panel here, messaging panel there. And then once I sign in with the username Patrick, I see the messaging panel because I'm already signed in. So the messaging panel is going to be here. And the purpose of the messaging panel is actually we don't need these divs. It's just a container. So fragment, let's use a fragment just so we don't edit the DOM too much to get the two components that we really want, which are display conversation and messaging box, which we're going to implement next. So display conversation, messaging box, and remember we have to import these two. So we're going to do an import of display conversation from display conversation, and we also want to do the same import with messaging box. So the easiest one to implement is messaging box, because messaging box is just that text panel, the text area. So we want a text area here, text area there, and with that text area we want, let's make it a little bit different. With text area, instead of having there being a form where you submit things, in terms of keeping up with other chat apps, once you just press enter, your message will be sent. So it's easier for the user to do this rather than having to use both a keyboard and a mouse. So let's do an on key down and create a function to handle that. So let's call that function this message handler. So we're going to implement that message handler up here. I'm going to use the fat arrow notation again, and it'll take in an event. And this event, let's make it prevent default. Actually, even before that, let's see what this event is. I want to use the enter. So I want to see what the enter key is. So let's do an e.keycode. What key code is enter? So first I have to log in. And then I'm going to be presented with nothing yet because I did not include the messaging box in. I did include the messaging box here. So we don't have a text area yet. Let's refresh again. Let's log in. There's our text area. It was just slow to update. So let's see what happens here in console. So if I press A, that's going to be 65. That's the key code for A, lowercase. If I press enter, it's 13. So let's make that 13. Let us say in message handler if key code is equal to 13. We want to prevent default. It didn't happen that we had a refresh in this browser, but maybe in different browsers. We don't want that happening. So let's do a prevent default just to be safe. And then we want e.target, which is the text area, its value, and we want its value to be sent somewhere, to be sent as a message. So let's grab this message. It would be best if we have our logic done in the messaging panel because it appears to be very container-like. So let's set let's set messages up here. Let's make messages an array and let's put all our messages there. And just like the other paradigm where we got username in one of our child components, messaging box is a child component of messaging panel where we want our state. So let us do get message as a prop in messaging box, and we'll send it a function that we define here in this component called get message, so we can grab it as we did with username, aka lifting state. So we'll use get message, and we'll define it here, and the thing that we want is a message. So we have access now to props called get message. So let's go into messaging box and let's go to this .props.get message. It's a function. So let's take our value, which is the message that we typed in here after pressing enter, and just to give it the illusion of a chat app, once you press enter, that message has been sent. So let's clear the value. Let's clear the text box, and we do that by that. So once we have the text box cleared, let us go back into the messaging panel, and we have that message. And that message we can store into messages by using set state. So let's get messages. Let's get, we're going to store 2 messages, and let's get the current messages via the spread operator. This.state.messages. We're going to get those current messages and place them about the new array along with the message that we retrieved. So that's going to happen there. And since this is a place where we are setting our messages to, we want them displayed in the conversation. But before that happens, we want them to be sent to the server so that everyone sees it and not just our displayed conversation component. So this is a good time to hop over to the WebSockets server. Let's just take a look at the status of our React front end though. Let's refresh this to be safe. I'm going to type in my username, which is Patrick, and let's type in hello. So we have an error with the spread operator. So our spread operator, we cannot spread undefined because our state is actually called messages and not the singular message. So let's try this. Let's see what the status of everything is. Patrick, and then let's say hello. And then we didn't do any console log debugging, but that's where we left off in setting it to our messages object up here. So let's open up our socket server. And let's go in and create server.js because that's what npm start will look at first. So remember, we installed some modules. Well, we installed one specifically called WS, which is WebSockets. And we need this in order to create a WebSocket server. So the way that we do that is through this line, and let's save it in our WebSocket server variable. And we can create a new instance of that WebSocket server by providing the port in a JavaScript object. And we can create that new instance and save it to a variable called WSS. And now, the thing that happens when you connect to a WebSocket server is exactly that. You connect. So let's create an event listener. The way that Node works is through event-driven programming. So we're going to attach an event listener to see once a user has provided a connection. Once there's a connection, on connection, we're going to take in a connection object that we can later manipulate to see what happens on it, what happens on the server. But let's keep track of these connections. And I'm going to keep track of these connections through an array called clients. And the way I'm going to add them is pushing them. I'm going to push all these connections onto there. And this is particularly helpful if I wanted to broadcast a message to all these clients, or if I wanted to see how many clients there were. If clients are leaving, if clients are entering, that's its purpose. So let's go into clients. Actually, we've done that. Let's set up one more event listener, which is the onMessage. And the onMessage is going to receive a message object. And this is basically if any client sends a message to the server, because this is the way that WebSockets operate. We're going to be sending data. We're going to be sending messages. So we have this message happening here, message object. So let's take a look at what this message object is. I'm going to try and send a message to this WebSocket server that we created. So let's have that message be sent. I'm going to put, let's just console log it out. So the way that I can check that that's working properly is by going into our messaging panel. And once we have a set state of messages, we can send a message. So let's send a message. But actually, this is not the way that we want to send that message. Because for that very same purpose, we want to be able to share that message. So instead of having a set state here, let us utilize, let's send the message to the server. And the way that we do that is using a new WebSocket. It's a WebSocket rather than a web server, because we are connecting to that web server, which is located at port 9090, which is what we specified before. And it's okay to have it out here rather than in state, because connection doesn't really have any impact on how any of these components are going to be rendered. So instead of setting state, let us do this.connection.send that message. But this is unidentified message. Remember, we also want to send the username along with that message, because we want to know which user sent that message. We don't want to display conversation just to be displaying information, messages without their respective usernames. So let us go in here in app where our username stays located and pass it down as props in messaging panel. So the way that we do that is exactly this way. Pass in username is equal to this.state.username. And then messaging panel has now access to that. So we're going to take that username and we're going to form an object. We're going to form a data object. Username is equal to this.props.username, since we have access to it now. And the message is going to be equal to the message argument that's being passed in from our child component of messaging box. So that messaging box took in a callback as a prop. So we can set it here once the user hits enter, and that will send it right back up here. So we're going to send it through this WebSocket server. And when we send it, we're sending this JavaScript object. This is a very important theme to remember. we're sending things to the internet as strings. We cannot send it in this format, this JavaScript object. So in order to make a send, we have to do json.parse of our data, stringify rather, so that this JavaScript object becomes a string. So now let us take a look at our app. I'm going to type in, let's refresh actually, and I have to activate our web server, our WebSocket server. So npm start, and now I can do a refresh on our front end. Let's do Patrick, and then what should we send? Let's send hello world, send, and let's take a look at what we received. Here in our WebSocket server, we received a string. This is a string in the format of a JSON in a JavaScript object. So we can take that, we can take a look at what we have here. Console.log, we're receiving that message. But the way that we want to work with that message is by parsing through it. We want to be able to use it. So strings aren't as helpful as JavaScript objects. So let's turn it into one. And then when I receive that message, I want to send it, I want to broadcast it to everybody. So this is why I made this clients array, because I want to do clients that for each, and then for each client that we stored in there, I want to do client.send that message, this data. So I'm sending it. However, since I'm sending it right away, right again, I want to stringify it. Now, it might seem counterintuitive to do this, parse and then immediately stringify, but we'll see this, why I'm doing this later. So stringify this and stringify that. So it's ready to be packaged off to the web. So everyone should see it. And we need a way of receiving messages. We have a way of receiving messages in the server, in the WebSocket, but we do not have a way of receiving messages in the front end. So I want to go into my container and create an object, create an event listener. An event listener for this .connection.onMessage, just like I have in the backend, in the WebSocket server. So this is what I want. But where do I put it in a React app? I only want it to happen, I only want one of these, so I'm going to put it in component did mount, because this is only going to get called once. I don't want to put it in render, which is going to be called multiple times. And this event is going to accept a message, and I'm going to take that message, and I want to, it's in a string, so you know what, let's see what it is. So I should have the message appear here as well. So I have error on 15 messaging panel. Yes, arrow needed. Alright, I'm going to have to reset this, because after an activity of 300 milliseconds, it goes out. Refresh this, and then let's log in. Alright, I'm going to type in hello Pluto. Alright, now we see a message. We see the message being transmitted. Back there I might have removed it, but here I see it being transmitted here. It's actually being transmitted through dot data. There's a data attribute, and it's a string. That means I have to change it. This is a string. So the way that I can change it back into a JavaScript object is to parse. So now we can work with this. And we can take this information and put it into messages, everyone's messages, because this is going to be an event listener for everybody rather than putting it in your own event listener, in your own state. Just your own state was what we ran into before. So we don't want to set to state, we want to put it into the WebSocket, which is what we did, and then we're going to broadcast it out to everyone. That WebSocket is in charge of sharing it to everybody, every client that's connected. So let us do this, .set state, and we're going to take messages, and we're going to do the spread operator to get all the previous messages that were attributed to this state. And then we're going to add our message, which is data. So that's great. We can then take all these messages and display them by passing them down as props in display conversation. All right, and let's go and implement display conversation, it's not that hard. We just have to display them. So we're going to go here and we're going to have access to this .props display messages rather, and we want to map through them. So we're going to map through each message, and we want to display them each on a line for their own. So let's go through the messages. Remember that in message, the way that we packaged it, that we sent it to the server in messaging panel was not rather than messaging panel. The way that we packaged them up in messaging panel right here is we attach the username along with the message. So we have access to message, that username, and we also have access to the message itself by typing in .message. So let's get this up like that. And then we can actually put this in a different function to make it a little bit easier to read. And we can have this happen in one line. It's not that big. Maybe if it gets bigger, we'll attach those curly brackets. So we have display message down here, this display message. Should display all the messages that are added to the messaging state in the messaging panel from the broadcast from the server. So let's see what happens. We have to restart our server. We were inactive for quite a while. Never can get less than 300 milliseconds. So let's type in hello. Oh look, there's hello. Hi, how are you? Now does it work? Does it work if we open up a different browser, different tab? Let's open up Firefox and see what's happening. So let's get in localhost. And I'm going to log in as Diane. I'm going to say hello. And let's get them side by side up so we can see it in real time. I see you. That was cool. Alright, so we have that functionality. And that's how we implement WebSockets through React. But there's a problem. We're going to solve this problem after I do a little bit more of making it more user informative. And that is by trying to alert the user when, say, Diane has entered the room. So the way that I'm going to do that is go through server. Because server knows when someone has entered a room because it has a connection event listener. So with that connection event listener, I want to broadcast to everybody, a user has entered the room. So we can actually use this line down here up in our broadcast, because this is essentially a broadcast. So let's make it its own function down here so we can reuse it. So here's broadcast, and I want to take in, let's see, the data. So let's do message. So I can do const data is equal to, we're taking in a message, but I want to stringify it if I'm bringing it out to the internet. So I want to stringify message, and then we're going to broadcast this data to all the clients that we have stored. So we can just say broadcast right here, message, rather data. Alright, so let's create a broadcast up here. I want to create a broadcast after a connection to say what are our two objects in there. First we have a username, two attributes inside the object. First is a username, and the next is a message. And let's say a user has entered the room. Alright, now let's check. Let's see what's happening. I will have to restart this. Alright, and then refresh that, refresh that. Alright, that's true. A user has entered the room. I've entered the room. Type in Diane. Oh, the user has entered the room there. Hi, user. I'm the user. Alright, so we have that. Now, we have this, when we leave the room, we don't see that user leaving the room. And when everyone leaves the room and we try to log back in, we have a problem. That's that inactivity problem. Hello, what's happening, console? It's closed. And it says it right here. It's closed because we have inactivity. We can send ping and pongs, very useless messages. Well, they're useful in keeping the server alive, but not as messages for to view. So we need a way of keeping the server alive by doing that, or an even better way is telling the user, all the users, through a broadcast message that a user has left the room. So let's do something like that. I'm going to call it cleanup, because we're going to take this clients array and we're going to clean it up among users who are not there. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to go through clients. Let's save one. Let's call this clients who are leaving. And the way that we find the clients that are leaving are we're going to go through the clients list. We're going to filter through it. We're going to find the client, each client. We're going to see if there's something called the ready state. And if the ready state is equal to, there's a constant inside the client called closed, that means they're not there anymore. It's closed. So those are the clients who are leaving. And I want to see the clients who are not leaving, which means their state isn't closed. And I actually want to set it back to clients, so to keep this list updated. So I'm going to set it equal to clients, but that means I have to make this let. And then after that, I want to be able to broadcast that message. We want to broadcast it. But we want to broadcast it for all of these clients who are leaving. So say like a client has left. For each client who has left, client, I want to broadcast that message. And the message that I want to broadcast is username. Let's call it admin again. And then message, let's call it, let's say a user has left the room. And I'm going to need to set this to an interval to run it over and over again. Good thing set interval takes in a callback, which is clean up. And let us make it run every 100 milliseconds. Since the inactivity period, which the server disappears, which its connection disconnects, is 300. So let us power on our sockets again. And now let us go and play with our app. Let's see, I want to be Patrick. And the user has entered the room, that was me. And let's put Diane. Oh, the user has entered the room here. Let's say, hello. It's functioning as we saw it to be before. Let's say, I am going to leave the room. And then if I leave the room, a user has left the room. Let's say I leave the room too. And then I go back, and then I go to localhost, and then I say Patrick. Oh, it's not closed because we have that interval that's going on for 100 milliseconds, and there is always activity when that's happening. So that is how we can implement a simple React WebSocket server. And you can go ahead and style this in the way that you want, or create different features, all by using this very basic logic on how to implement a WebSocket server Chatroom.